Today we're reviewing Noctua's brand new NH-D15 G2 coolers, and there are 3 variations of them, which is why we have them in our laser scanner, because we are evaluating Noctua's claims of having a special curvature to the cold plate to better accommodate the different CPU integrated heat spreader styles, or IHSs. You can already see the impact from the cold plate tuning that Noctua has done. The LBC model, or low base convexity cold plate, has one of the flattest contact patches we've ever seen. This should be good for AMD CPUs, and likewise, HBC, or high base convexity, is visibly more convex than the LBC variation. This should tune well for Intel's platform CPUs, which we've previously scanned and shown as heavily concave in our custom cold plate design video. We'll also be testing acoustics in our hemi-anechoic chamber, because a lot of Noctua's last 10 years working on the D15 to get to Gen 2 has been focused on the acoustic to thermal response. So that's what this is for. And of course, we also have thermal testing on our new Intel 14900KF bench, 250 watts for that. And we did a bunch of pressure testing on these because these CPU coolers have those special cold plates, and we needed to be able to show how they affect the different contact patches for the CPU IHSs, and that was done with a special chemically reactive paper. And then we have the classic AMD test bench that we use with dozens of coolers now run through it. And because this is apparently something Noctua only does every 10 years or so, launching a flagship product, we wanted to make sure we built a review that can withstand the test of time. Because people might be referencing this review in 2033 or 4. That's kind of painful to think about. Before that, this video is brought to you by NZXT's C1500 Platinum Power Supply, which has passed the Cybernetics Titanium standard for efficiency. NZXT has been certified for efficient operation upwards of 94% and uses a 140mm fan to help run quieter under load. This 180mm form factor power supply is fully modular, using capacitors rated for 105 degrees Celsius. Learn more at the link in the description below. It seems complicated, but it's actually pretty straightforward. First of all, this is $150. It is very expensive. It includes in the box 2 of the new NF-A14 by 25R G2 fans. So those are the round edition G2 fans. It also has washers for a potential washer mod on Intel, all the mounting hardware for the various sockets and motherboards, and some accessories. This is the most expensive air cooler we have ever tested, so it's gonna have to perform. There's no elephant in the room here. Everybody knows it's expensive. Noctua knows it's expensive, and everyone's already talked about it for the last month because that's when it was announced, for the price at least. The cooler itself was announced many years ago, and then again and again. But it's here now, and that price is at this point established. So that puts the NH-D15 G2 as about $30 to $40 more expensive than an Arctic Liquid Freezer 360 Black Edition, meaning no LEDs, depending on the time you check the price of that liquid cooler, just to set the stage for this. So it is expensive. So there are 3 coolers, and there's only one difference between them. It's really simple. It's the cold plate. The cold plate is this part. This is the original D15, same idea. So the cold plate is the part that contacts the integrated heat spreader, the IHS, that is attached to the CPU. The IHS can be either flat or it can have a curvature to it. And so that curvature is something we showed in a separate engineering video if you want to learn more about it, something we experimented with. But basically, Intel CPUs right now, especially because the way it clamps with the ILM, or the independent loading mechanism, which is basically that socket clamp, that will deform the CPU slightly down and in to create a concavity on the Intel side, which means if you want to get the perfect cold plate for that, you would theoretically have basically a mating convex cold plate to sink down into that concave deformation in the IHS. So that's the difference between the 3 of them. The 3 models are called HBC, LBC, and then just G2. We're calling it G2 standard to be clear. HBC is high base convexity, LBC is low base convexity. So moving from the G to the LBC, you would optimize AM to the D. Sorry, just LBC and Snoop. The point is, LBC is preferable for AMD, HBC is what you'd buy for Intel, and then the standard model is kind of the all-arounder. It'll work fine on everything. We validated it. That's the one where you're maybe not sure what you'll use it on, or you want to use the cooler for the next 10 years. while you wait for the G3. And in that case, you'd buy the standard model to just hedge your bets. This review is really dense today. I don't want to hold up getting to the data to read a brochure and a spec sheet. We're going to give you some highlights and then move on rapidly. If you want more detail on any of the core specs of the product, go to their website or watch our Computex News coverage video. The new NF-A14x25R G2 fans use Noctua's PPA and PPB design, which offsets the RPM of the two fans intentionally by about 25 RPM each by using a driver IC feature called Super Torque. This feature allows Noctua to basically eliminate the chance of encountering a beat frequency phenomenon, which we discussed at length in a recent technical interview with Noctua. If you want to learn more about what that is, it is something that we have observed in our own testing. It's basically when you get an annoying noise that occurs because of two fans that are effectively interfering with each other. We've got some graphics on the screen. All right, the fans are also made of a liquid crystal polymer, which is a relatively expensive material. It's used in high-end fans, and that is intentionally used to allow the blade tips to be about 0.7 millimeters away from the inner frame here. This should maximize the performance, but LCP is expensive, and it was used to retain the fan's shape even when under those centripetal forces as it spins. It's also supposed to help for long-term endurance and aging. And then finally, another quick feature is that the heat pipe count has changed from the NH-D15 original to the G2. It's gone from 6 heat pipes now up to 8 heat pipes. Go to their website if you want more of the basics, but we're not here for basics. So the Coldplates are the first engineering feature to look at, and that is because they are supposed to be curved specially for each IHS. We can validate that with our 3D laser scanner. So we're going to jump over to that for high resolution scans and evaluate the cold plate curvature of each model. This is a scientific testing machine that we bought for $60,000 with support from our community by buying our mod mats, solder mats, and toolkits on store.gamersnexus.net. The laser in this machine has a repeatability of 0.5 microns on the vertical axis, which allows us to measure the point-to-point depth. Here's a scan of the standard NH-D15 G2. Magnifying 100x helps to illustrate the curvature. You can see that the plate is slightly convex, protruding down towards the CPU IHS. The central spike can be ignored. That's from an anti-reflective coating we used where it accumulated, but this is a very slight curvature, and it's comparable to competing coolers of basically all price ranges. Here's a scan of the high base convexity plate, built mostly for Intel's concave deformation under the stock ILM. At 1x, you can already see that the center is going to protrude more than the last one. At 100x, that protrusion becomes immediately obvious as compared to standard. It's not just marketing, they really are changing the cold plates. And now we're on the LBC. With so much drama in the LBC, we can see what is actually the flattest cold plate that can be. It's impressive how flat Noctua got this plate, to the extent that it caused us problems when we were trying to contemplate, when we were trying to remove it from AM4 CPUs, since it basically suctioned itself to the CPU. That's a testament to flatness, and in a good way, for AM4 and AM5 alike. So that'll cover the cold plate stuff with the laser scanner. If you're interested in this topic and you want to learn more about it, we have a whole separate deep dive video where actually we didn't even know Noctua was working on different cold plate styles when we started that project and published it. And it happened to align really well as educational material for something that they hadn't yet announced in terms of like what they were doing. So you check that out. We're getting into thermals now. So the AMD test bench is our classic bench. The methodology has been published forever. We've also introduced a 14900 KF bench that is running at 250 watts for the CPU package power. The actual EPS 12 volt power consumption is around 270 watts. Obviously, depending on how cool the CPU is, there is more or less leakage there, more or less inefficiency, and so that number moves a little bit, but we've talked about that in the past. The types of tests we're doing are going to be 100% fan speed and noise normalized, and that's on the two different platforms, so 200 watt AMD, 250 watt Intel. We have 200 watt Intel numbers as well. They're not that interesting, mostly because to truly show the difference between high-end coolers, air or liquid, you need the highest possible heat load that they can handle without being unreasonable. That allows you to see a bigger gap between them, so that's what we're showing here today. For the testing, when we did tests where we swapped the different LBC, HBC, and standard coolers to determine how well or poorly they might perform with a different CPU IHS, we kept the same mounting hardware and we kept the same fans. And so in those specific tests, all we're doing is swapping the tower itself, and that's because what we're trying to do is isolate the variable of the cold plate. Now, you can't perfectly do that. There's some heat pipe binning differences. There might be differences in the manufacturing quality of the total solution for the heat sink. But the point is, minimizing those variables so that we can just look at the base convexity and how much that impacts it to the extent reasonable. The other thing we did, we have some old versus new fan testing where we took the old D15 fans, threw them on the new cooler, and tested them A to B. For that one, we had the exact same mount, so not only the same cooler, the same tower, the same hardware, but we didn't even remove it. And then we did that multiple mounts. We did multiple passes per mount. So for a lot of these, we're looking at as many as 6 to, there's probably some that are like 9 test passes, and that's at the high end, and that allows us to get the resolution we want for testing. So let's get into the numbers. On to 200 watt AMD testing. We'll start again with only the full speed Noctua results in the charts, so we can compare a lot of variations at once. This test uses the older acoustic testing methodology, so these noise levels are presented differently. Despite representing the same thing as previously, they can get louder from the Intel testing. It's all the same, just tested different ways. The NH-D15 G2 LBC is the best result here, which makes sense. Tested with the same fans and mounting hardware as the others, it ends up functionally tied with the HBC and the standard results. This isn't too surprising. We saw similar results on AM4 with our prior Coldplate flatness testing, so that represents here. Despite having a theoretical best match with a flat plate, AMD isn't as sensitive to the designs as Intel. This is because you can't end up with a massive gap centrally, which you can with Intel. With AMD, even if the base plate is highly convex like on HBC, it'll still apply massive pressure dead center and relatively close to the chiplet dies. In the case of HBC, it ends up lining up over the silicon with an offset mount applied. These numbers all make sense. Using the non-offset mounting produced the worst results of the G2 cooler so far, though it was still better than the older D15. The G2 without an offset landed at 52.5 degrees Celsius over ambient at 200 watts here, or an improvement of 0.6 degrees Celsius with the offset mount on LBC. The D15 that we bought in 2023 landed at 53.3 degrees Celsius over ambient at about the same noise level and slightly lower RPM. Standard is therefore about 1 degree improved, and LBC is about 1.4 degrees improved. That's a lot, considering the fan speed and noise are so similar. The old model D15 from 2015 or 2016 or so runs a little louder and faster, but has worse thermals. This cooler has been around for years, and it's been through a lot in our testing. While the metal theoretically shouldn't age much, this can be explained by things like potential manufacturing refinement over the decade of production, fatigue or weakening in the metal fan clips or the rubber corner of the fans from age that may soften the connection with the towers and the flushness, or if any changes have been made over the years. When noise normalized, the G2 LBC ran at 55 degrees over ambient, leading the standard model by 0.5 degrees Celsius. We didn't test HBC in this heat load, but we already saw those results. The D15 we bought last year allows the G2 a lead of 1.6 degrees Celsius, and our original unit falls much further behind, again, for reasons we mentioned in the previous section. And before getting into the comparative tests, let's look at some feature tests on Intel isolated as well. This is a 250 watt heat load on the 14900 KF and noise normalized. The test uses our hemi-anechoic chamber, so the noise is collected a different way than you saw in the AMD testing a moment ago. The distance is further at 1 meter, and the noise floor is lower. That's why the numbers are different. Looking at just the Noctua results here, the NH-D15 G2 HBC with the new fans ran at 57.8 degrees Celsius over ambient P-core and 50.8 all-core. Attaching the old fans from our 2023 NH-D15 unit, we end up noise normalized with a slightly slower RPM since the newer fans are marginally quieter when they're matched with this tower. And that's important because free flow noise is one thing, but how it interacts specifically with the tower it's attached to is what ultimately really matters. The older fans ran 2.4 degrees warmer with the same heatsink, the same mounting hardware, and in fact the same mount itself, so it wasn't removed between the fan swap. And that means that the test between new and old fans was exactly like for like because it was all done on the same configuration without any changes other than the fan swap. And we did multiple passes as always. With the old tower, that one was running about 3 degrees warmer when noise normalized as compared to the new one. And here's the Noctua-Only Intel data at 100% fan speeds, also for 250 watts. In this test, the HBC model posted an improvement to 53.3 degrees from 55.9 degrees on the NH-D15 that we bought in 2023, which is a 2.6 degree change in P-core average. Noise levels are equal between old and new in this test. Adding the washer mod brought the result down an additional 0.8 degrees Celsius, but we wouldn't recommend using it for the reasons that we'll talk about later. It does work though, it actually does something here. Now for the comparative 250 watt Intel results when noise normalized in the chamber. The Liquid Freezer 3 predictably leads the charts here and is currently the only liquid cooler we have in this new dataset. At 48.1 degrees over ambient for P-cores, it leads the NH-D15 G2 HBC by 9.7 degrees. That is a huge advantage and shows where liquid still rules, which is dealing with high heat loads. We'd still recommend liquid for running Intel at full tilt. The NH-D15 G2 does well though. At 57.8 degrees P-core average, it's the coolest air cooler we've run through this new testing approach when noise normalized on Intel. It's outperforming the ID Cooling A720 by 2.9 degrees Celsius here, which is great since the A720 is a relatively massive cooler, and it's a lot cheaper than the D15 G2. So it's important that the G2's ahead. And ultimately, this is actually a huge gap for air coolers and is bigger than most of what we saw in our flatter AMD IHS testing at 200 watts. Larger gaps form at higher temperatures and with more concavity of the IHS. The G2 HBC leads the Peerless Assassin by a somewhat impressive 4.4 degrees here. Now that's still over $100 more expensive for those 4 degrees on the G2, but it's important again that Noctua is at least the best air cooler that exists at these prices, and in this specific comparison it achieves that. The lead over the AK620 and A620 from Deepcool and ID Cooling respectively is noteworthy, with the A620 underperforming in this test as compared to some of the other results. Our next chart will be for 200 watts on AMD for comparative thermals. We'll move to the full comparison chart at 100% fan speed now. The G2 LBC model with the offset is our reference point. At 100% fan speeds, the NH-D15 is only outperformed by the louder coolers on this chart. The Assassin 4, which is no longer available in the US due to sanctions we covered in a hardware news episode, is about tied with the G2 while running 2 dBA louder. The ID Cooling A720 with dual 140s and a tall tower ends up better than the G2 LBC by 1.4 degrees Celsius, but is also a considerable 5.1 dBA louder. That's definitely a noticeable increase in noise. Typically, most people will notice at 3 dBA, but you can definitely notice less than that, just depends how sensitive your hearing is. The G2 LBC outperforms the $45 louder ID Cooling Frozen A620 marginally. The Thermalright Peerless Assassin, meanwhile, is a similar noise level to the Noctua G2 and holds a 53.4 degree result, allowing Noctua a 1.5 degree advantage. The Peerless Assassin has a massive price advantage though, at around $120 cheaper, tends to be about $35, so that's huge and it can't be ignored. In the vast majority of use cases, it makes way more financial sense to buy something else and put the money towards silicon or just your savings. Cooler Master's MA824 is also new to this chart and underperforms massively, so we'll skip that one. The Arctic Liquid Freezer 3360 is one of the most noise-efficient coolers on this chart and is liquid. It's at 39.8 dBA for a 45 degree result, so a lead of 6.5 degrees. This cooler is currently $117 or $33 cheaper than the G2. As you'd expect, liquid remains superior in pure cooling capacity, despite other limitations like radiator size, the introduction of a pump to the system, things like that. The noise normalized results on the 200 watt AMD heat load have the G2 cooler as tied with the ID Cooling's A720 for the best result on the chart. That has the G2 ahead of the smaller Peerless Assassin by 1.2 degrees when matched on the same noise level, and ahead of the Assassin 4 by the same. The Liquid Freezer 360 runs at 47.3 degrees when noise normalized, a 7.9 degree advantage. As expected, Liquid tends to start pulling ahead even more when noise levels are brought down. The last one for CPU thermals, at least for core temperatures, is back to Intel at 250 watts, but now with full fan speeds. In this test, the NH-D15 G2 HBC ran at 53.3 degrees without the washer mod, allowing the Liquid Freezer 3 a lead of 7.1 degrees, or 6.3 degrees when against the washer mod. The A720 closes the gap here by running louder, with a 4.4 dBA climb and under 2 degrees of difference. The Peerless Assassin is in the 57 degree range, giving Noctua's G2 roughly a 4 degree advantage once again. The Liquid Freezer 3 is the most impressive overall, with a 32 dBA result and chart-topping performance. It's quieter and cooler. But it should be, because it's a 360mm radiator that's relatively thick and also filled with liquid. For air, Noctua is leading what we've run through so far. This chart is for the core-to-core deltas on Intel with a 250 watt test at 25 dBA normalized. For this, we're measuring a range of the hottest to the coldest cores. This is a useful metric for both overclocking and borderline TJ Maxx boosting behavior, because it informs you how much your hottest core will limit your total CPU, especially for an all-core OC. Although the actual CPU soldering and lid affect this, the cooler's hotspots will likewise influence it. Hotter overall results will lead to a higher core-to-core delta in general by nature of just how these Intel CPUs behave. Here, the Liquid Freezer 3's core-to-core delta is 15.8 degrees Celsius, which is actually pretty great. The NH-D15 G2 HBC has a 17-degree range. And sadly, we would still consider this good for Intel. Sadly, because we'd like to see lower, but as the Liquid Freezer 3 shows us, Intel eventually steps in to bottleneck it with just the differences in its manufacturing process and IHS thickness. The A720 has a 19-degree delta, with the Peerless Assassin at about 20 degrees. Noctua is doing well in this one. We'll look at the pressure distribution now. This evaluates a mixture of the cold plate design and the mounting hardware. Intel is up first. On the screen are columns showing HBC, HBC with washers, LBC, and standard. Here's the HBC mount. In this one, you can see relatively good pressure application across the center of the CPU, which is where the die is. It's a little weaker on the top edge. The washers were a little more variable in what they produced as a result of the mounting difficulties that Mike will discuss later. One of these scans shows nearly perfect pressure distribution though. It hits the central die area, but also applies more pressure across the whole IHS. The other washer mod scan is less impressive, but still good overall. Here's LBC. This one is cool and shows exactly what we'd expect. The flatter cold plate has effectively no pressure centrally. It's still contacts, but it'll rely more on thermal paste, and it lacks firmer pressure to pull heat effectively from the die area. You should definitely not buy an LBC G2 if you're using it exclusively for Intel. It just wouldn't make sense. Noctua has better options with HBC. Finally, for the G2, this is standard. This one has overall even distribution of pressure. It doesn't show as much in the colors here, but the pressure is slightly higher in pascals or PSI if you prefer with the HBC solution than standard. Even still though, standard's doing well overall to contact most of the areas of the IHS. This is the cooler you'd want to use if you might swap it between AMD and Intel in the future. And this is similar to the original NH-D15's pressure distribution, which you can see in our test here. Just quickly, here are the AMD pressure maps. In these, you can see that the HBC solution applies high pressure in the chiplet area, which is the only reason it works okay. Clearly though, the LBC option is a better fit for AMD. The standard solution is lower pressure overall, but still good contact. If you're buying exclusively for AMD, LBC makes the most sense. Now for some acoustics. So the testing you're about to see is performed in this hemi-anechoic chamber. This chamber was a $250,000 construction project. So we spent 250 grand on this last year, built it out. The noise floor in here is 13.6 dBA. And so the whole construction project allows us to really increase the accuracy of our testing and the quality of it and get you some good noise samples that are controlled day to day. Actually, if we can bring in enough support through the GN store over the next year or two, our hope is to further increase the capabilities of this, because we're actually not limited by the chamber that I'm standing in, but we are now bottlenecked by our measurement equipment. So we could get sub 10 dBA if we can spend the relatively high amounts of money to upgrade that equipment. So for now, we've got a really solid chamber. Let's get into some cool acoustics. For this testing, we're measuring at a 1 meter distance from the front center of the fans away from the exhaust. The measurement methodology was created in partnership with Mike Chin, formerly of Silent PC Review, and a leading PC acoustics expert whom we hired for consulting on the test methods previously. We also have a separate build-out video of the chamber for those curious about how it's constructed and why it works so well. That features an interview and technical discussion with one of the build-out engineers. This frequency spectrum chart shows the Noctua NH-D15 with the G2 fans mounted and running at 100% speed. This includes the RPM offset that Noctua is applying via its PPA and PPB fans. We observed a repeatable higher noise level in the low frequency range of about 216 Hz that appeared in two separate tests. This looks to be a real result. Lower frequencies are generally regarded as more acceptable to the human ear and less annoying. We also observed a plateau around 800 to 1500 Hz with a gradual reduction in acoustic power across the higher frequency end of the spectrum. Adding the original D15 to this chart, including the original fans for it, we see that the prior higher volume spike has shifted. Instead of occurring around the 216 to 230 Hz range, it now happens around 330 Hz on the older model. Both coolers had a similar spike around 680 Hz, with the original D15 spiking louder. The older cooler had a few higher frequency and repeatable spikes in the 3000 Hz area as well, but overall had lower volume levels in this test in the higher frequency range of the chart, despite a few acute breakouts, and those are probably what Noctua was mostly trying to squash or shift. Ultimately, these fans are remarkably similar to each other in total volume level and in the acoustic profile. And now we'll get into some A-B comparison of playback. We won't tell you which is which fan until you hear both, so try to identify which you prefer. This helps to eliminate bias, such as towards the newer product. We'll play the first cooler and then the second cooler tests uninterrupted. There'll be a brief mute between them, but no voiceover, so you'll know what's changed. Note that these are not the exact clips we took for our frequency spectrum plot, and likewise, we had to boost the level so that it's audible at a similar volume to my voice in this video. You should be listening for the type of noise, not necessarily the volume. The first recording sounded lower pitched overall, or at least it has a lower emphasis or lower total volume on some of those higher frequencies. If you listen carefully though, you can notice a higher frequency, almost rattle-like noise that might be a motor bearing or electrical noise, but you have to listen pretty closely. So here, we'll isolate that frequency for you. This is from the first recording. The second one you listen to sounds louder in the higher frequency range overall, but lacks this potentially annoying higher pitched rattle. We'll play them one more time and in the same order, but with the names revealed. The first one is the D15 original, and the second one is the D15 G2. The G2 does end up with louder, higher frequencies in total, but it eliminates that potentially annoying noise that we observed and isolated. Generally speaking, the acoustic profile of these is relatively close, but Noctua has shifted it on the G2 to try and better accommodate human factors, like getting rid of that high frequency noise or just bringing down some of the spikes to lower frequencies where possible. So that was all the thermals. Let's get into the installation process. For this, I'm going to go over to Mike, and he's got some praise and some critiques of the installation process and of the washer mod.
It's finally here. Let's install it. So we're going to take a look at AMD first, and then Intel, and then after that we'll go over our feedback on the cooler. So first step here, we're going to remove the stock brackets that come on the motherboard. Won't be needing them. Next, we're going to put down our standoffs, which are gray in color for AMD. All right, now that the standoffs are in place, we're ready to install the brackets. The brackets are really well labeled here. So they're labeled north and south. They have 4 holes each that are labeled as -7mm and 0. This is for your AMD offset. And then per Noctua's instructions, we're going to use the offset today. The only reason they said not to use the offset was for clearance issues. So like if your PCI slot was too close to the cooler and was going to impact the graphics card. So let's get these in place. I've got my south down here at the PCI slot. And you'll notice now that I'm installing some of their hardware that they have moved over all their hardware away from Philips Head 2 or Philips into Torx T20. Thankfully, they included a really nice driver. All right, now that these are all torqued down, we're ready to put some thermal paste down. We'll go ahead, get the cooler installed. There's 2 retention screws here. I'm just gonna get these started. And then I'm gonna go back and forth alternating so that we get a nice even pressure. Now that the cooler's torqued down, we can go ahead and install our fans. I've got no RAM here, and they actually said we don't need to remove the front fan to install the cooler, but we found that the fan was definitely did not have enough clearance over our RAM on any of our benches to do that, so we did have to move that fan up during installation. So that takes care of the AMD installation. Let's move over to Intel. There's a lot to cover there. Okay, so for the first step on Intel, it's going to be assembling this backplate. So for Intel 1700, we're going to use the position labeled as 2, and that's really clearly labeled again on the backplate here. Their labeling is very good all over this cooler. It makes the installation Very easy. So they've got this little retention, I guess you'd call it a washer, clip, ring, and you just push that in and that holds the standoff into the backplate itself. All right, with that assembled, we can go ahead and place it through the motherboard. And I like to do this on a flat surface so that it holds that backplate up in a place where I can attach the rest of the hardware. Next up is the standoffs. And these are going to be blue for LGA 1700. Your other Intel sockets are going to be black. Now, depending on Intel, you can change the orientation of your cooler. For this, we want the intake coming in over the RAM. And again, our labeling is really good on this bracket. It's labeled 2 for Intel 1700. And we'll get these nuts started on top. Okay, with the brackets installed, we're ready to put down some thermal paste. We'll go ahead and place our cooler down on top. And I'm just going to alternate left to right here every few turns to make sure I get a nice even pressure. And these can be tightened down until they stop, and then the cooler is nice and secured. The next step next and final step would be the fans, but we're gonna go ahead and take the cooler back off and take a look at the washer mod that's included with all of these G2 coolers. So all 3 SKUs of the NH-D15 G2 come with these washers, and these go underneath the ILM, and that effectively just raises the ILM up. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Now, Noctua advises that you do this with the CPU in the motherboard, and we agree. So find a nice flat surface and go ahead and put your CPU in and leave it there for the entirety of this installation. So the first step here is going to be removing the ILM. Now, this ILM screws into a backplate that's on the other side of this motherboard. If you want a better look at that, you can check out our contact frame videos. Okay, now that the ILM has been removed, let's go ahead and take our washers out. And then we'll just place them over the 4 holes where the ILM screws in. And now we're going to reinstall our ILM with those washers in between the motherboard and the ILM. As we're seeing, one of the problems both Steve and I had was getting these threads to catch. This is kind of difficult. So right now I'm pushing up on the backplate so that I can get these threads to catch on the backplate. There she goes. Okay, that's one. And with the ILM reinstalled, we can go ahead and close our socket here. Now, the rest of the installation is the same as the Intel installation we just went over. So we're going to go ahead and move into our feedback. Positives with the cooler, things we like. So the fan clips that come with the G2 are updated, and they do a great job of just staying in the fan and make installation much easier. Your typical fan clip, which will look something like this is actually off of a Fuma 3, has a tendency to just want to pull out of the fan as you're installing it. I'm sure everybody here has kind of experienced that. The build quality of the cooler is what you come to expect from Noctua, so they've kind of maintained that standard in this cooler as well. It's a very nice cooler. All the hardware is really nice. So our first criticism, on some of the newer coolers, including the Fuma 3, for example, the standoffs on the Fuma 3 have rubber inside of them so that when you place the standoff onto the backplate, it actually retains it so that you can move the motherboard around, and that's kind of a nice quality ease of use feature I'm really coming to like, and I would like to see that on coolers of this caliber. Our other big criticism is the washer mod. We don't recommend it. Both Steve and I had a fair amount of trouble with the installation of the washer mod, especially initially. It was pretty tough. We followed the Noctua instructions step by step. We used a flat surface, but despite that, both of us had to reach behind, just like in this installation segment, and push up on the Intel backplate. in order to get it to start to thread. The amount of engagement you have with the threads is pretty minimal before it starts applying torque to those threads. So much so that, again, we don't recommend it. It didn't feel good. It wasn't, it felt like we were gonna over torque it or strip something out. Two things we recommend to Noctua that they could do to fix this. They could include screws, much like the Liquid Freezer 3 for their contact frame. They actually include new screws to use with their contact frame, or they could make the washers thinner. If there's some technical reason they don't wanna include longer screws, then we, again, recommend making the washers thinner. But they probably don't want to give up any of the gains that they're getting with those larger washers. But that wraps up the installation segment, and I'm going to throw it back to Steve.
The core of our reviews is a value judgment. You don't buy this for value, plain and simple. You can look at the NH-D15 G2 almost like a 4090 or something. It doesn't quite have that same performance gap that the 4090 would have, but what you're paying for effectively with the NH-D15 G2 is brand credibility. And so what that means is theoretically its support system, the engineering, things like that. Now, our review boils down like this. If you have your heart set on the NH-D15 G2 and you can afford it, then sure, go for it. Just know that you're paying a lot of money for something where performance-wise you can get something very similar that is still an air cooler for cheaper. If you're okay with that, then great. We do like the cooler. It is an engineering marvel in some ways. The fans mostly. It performs exceptionally well. They've managed to hit a lot of the same points that the original did while still improving it in some key areas, namely the cold plate styling. So it's just that from a consumer standpoint, there are simply too many close competitors that are cheaper, that are very close to just as good, if not literally just as good. And of course, liquid coolers are just straight up better in basically any metric, with the exception being, once again, if you want to make the argument of reliability, multiple points of failure, things like that, go for it, go buy an air cooler instead, that's fine. But you are buying the name with this cooler. And we don't recommend it outright for the majority of our audience for the reasons we've stated. We are, however, impressed with it. And if you don't care about the reasons we've stated, then we do think it's a good cooler. So go for it. I'm not going to talk some out of it if they really want to buy it, because it was fun to work on and it does work really well. So there's that aspect of it. All right, that's it. This is the most intense review cycle we've ever done for an air cooler. We got this done in record time. It was like basically a 24-hour stint of really hardcore focus, and then a week of prep and build up with all the rest of the charts. So huge effort the whole team put into this one, and it was fun working on. Thanks for supporting us directly. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net. Please pick up something there, like this shirt. We still have some of these in stock. We ordered some extras. The manufacturing run's on the way. That supports us directly, because the equipment we used in this video we could not have bought without the help from the audience. So thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.